Hey guys, it's your Peacekeeper coming at you with the video you have all been asking for, and that is World War II camouflage patterns on ships. What are they, what was their purpose, and did they work, and what impact do they have in-game? Well, the purpose of naval camouflage is quite simple. Unlike land-based camouflage, which is attempting to actually physically hide the ship, naval-based camouflages were primarily intended to confuse lookouts, people operating rangefinders, submarine captains looking through periscopes, and anyone else looking at the ship as to the range of the ship, the direction that it's traveling, the speed, or the actual shape of the ship so that it impaired identification of the ship. Most attempts to hide a ship outright failed, predominantly because when you're sailing on the ocean, the silhouette of the ship is always going to be present. And really, the only time we saw any true attempts to obscure a ship entirely was when they were stationary. Obviously, the most famous one of these is the Tirpitz hiding in her fjords during World War II. They utilized buoys out in the fjord to actually look like the ship from the air, and then they covered it with camo netting. Reasonably effective, and it did help stave off some of the attacks on her. Some of the bizarre camouflage patterns we see in-game, though, are actually based on real designs. And we'll talk about those as we get to those nations. Let's go ahead and start talking about the U.S. first. The most commonly used camouflage pattern by the U.S. Navy during World War II is Measure 22. It consists of a solid blue hole below a certain point on the hull. In the case of the Missouri here, it would be the deck and down straight horizontal across. The top was painted a light gray color, and the purpose of this was actually to obscure the true range of these ships. And as you can imagine, it was actually made obsolete by radar, because by the time radar gave us accurate ranging data, camouflage patterns no longer mattered. In terms of how it worked, well, to understand how Measure 22 works, we have to talk about how ships were ranged using optical rangefinders. They were used a method of range finding. You can see the rangefinders up here. There's two glass optics on each side of the little arms up there. And what they would do is they would overlay images of the ship. On some of these ships, especially on submarines, the overlay of the images happened by a vertical plane. And what you would do is you'd line up the bottom line with the water line of the ship. The top line would go, or the top image would go to a designated point, usually the highest mast on the ship. And those numbers were known by, comparing relative sizes of stuff to known objects. Like if they happen to catch a picture with people on deck, they can get the relative height within a reasonable degree of accuracy to a certain point. And so what this did is it actually made it very difficult to find the true water line of the ship. As you can imagine, if you were staring at this out at sea and you were trying to hurry up and get an accurate range on it, it'd be very difficult to pick out the true water line down here when you're lining up those images in order to get the range. So Measure 22 saw a lot of use by the United States in World War II, and it is by far the most common. It also seems to be the only one in game that actually has even, I would say, like a minute chance to work, because it does obscure on some maps the true waterline of these ships, and I have seen plenty of people miss, and it was one of the big reasons why this camouflage was taken out of the game as the base camouflage for U.S. ships during the closed beta period when the U.S. battleships and all the other U.S. ships were just coming out. And that's why we have the default flat gray holes in game instead of Measure 22 like we had in closed beta. The other really common US one that was used widely in World War II is Measure 32. And Measure 32 consists of lighter and darker blues with grays on dark polygon laid out on the side of the ship. As you can see here on the Missouri, it also included a false bow wave painted into the hull. And the purpose of this was to obscure the actual speed of the ship and the shape of the ship to a limited extent. The camouflage patterns would create false bows, as well as the false bow wave. And you know, for the most part, it worked. The interesting thing is that Missouri herself only wore this camouflage pattern during her trials after her construction. To my knowledge, she never actually went into combat with this. She actually received a different camouflage pattern almost immediately after getting done with her speed trials. Measure 32 is definitely an interesting one. However, in-game it has very limited effect. The next most popular one for the United States was the Dazzle camouflage pattern, and this was predominantly used during the early war periods and not so much in the late war periods. The purpose of Dazzle camouflage was to confuse people looking at the ship as to where, you know, its direction of travel and where the bow of the ship was. It did also do a very good job of obscuring the different features on the ship and could make identification pretty difficult. This was predominantly used in World War I, but it was used in limited use in World War II, and it didn't quite look exactly like this, but you can see these dark lines could create, at distance, if you're looking at the ship up against the horizon, it could create a false bow and shorten or lengthen the ship depending on what you're looking at. And if you looked at it from a quartering profile like this, you can also see how that would confuse you as to the true front of the ship if you weren't fully sure of where it was at. And, you know, it's very easy to see it in game with the high contrast colors of the maps, but in real life, when you're looking up against the, you know, the gray background of the horizon and the sky, these camouflage patterns were actually very effective at throwing off sub-captains in particular as to the location and direction of a ship. The Japanese Navy, well, let's go on down here to the Yamato. The Japanese Navy was probably the least consistent with their camouflage patterns. For the most part, their capital ships did not use camouflage patterns. There were a couple of them that did have them, mostly carriers. Some of the battleships did, but overwhelmingly they stuck to the gray hulled ship paint. They didn't do a whole lot of camouflage. Of course, Yamato and Musashi, when they were doing their night transits on their suicide missions, they painted the decking black using soot. And that's about the extent of what Yamato actually saw in terms of camouflage. Other ships, though, like I said, the carriers are probably the most notable examples of camouflage patterns employed by the Japanese. And they did use greens and browns as well as grays in their camouflage patterns. And the purpose of these were primarily looking from the top of the ship. If we were to pull up an aircraft carrier, I can show you here on Shikaku. The premium camouflage, you can see on the top of the hull the pattern that they employed. And what this was designed to do was designed to make the ship look like an entirely different ship from the air. And it was also designed to confuse the, you know, dive bomber captains as to the true center of the ship, because the dive bombers, they always wanted to drop the bombs in the middle of the ship. It was the easiest thing to hit. And so these camouflage patterns were designed to hide that as best they could. Did they work? Not so much. They predominantly used greens and browns up against a blue ocean or a dark brown ocean, depending on where you were at, and it really didn't work out too well for them. I would say the vast majority of the camouflage patterns employed by the Japanese were for when they were parked stationary in a harbor to obscure them from, say, subs. I think that's probably the most accurate way to describe their camouflage patterns and their intents. Germany has some very interesting designs. Let me pull up the Hindenburg here. The Germans predominantly used modified Dazzle camouflage patterns. If you remember from the US, it consisted of those light and dark, hard angular lines. The Germans modified it slightly with a little bit larger dark patches, and they predominantly stuck to gray, black, and white for their colors. In fact, if we pull up Tirpitz is a perfect example of this. You'll note that the ends are painted white, and the rest of the hull is painted the black and gray. The white is designed to create a false bow and a false stern of the ship to confuse the actual length of the ship, which could throw off identification. The alternating stripes here would also obscure the profile of the ship. And ultimately, these camouflage patterns, you know, Tirpitz, her biggest contribution to naval camouflage was her stationary camouflage with the buoys, like I said at the beginning of this video. These camouflage patterns were colored around the colors predominantly seen in the North Atlantic, and that will be a common theme when we get to the British as well. The coloration really hovered around certain colors due to weather conditions, and that's why on the U.S. ships we see a lot of the whites and blues. On the British and the German ships we will see the blacks and grays, and on the Russian ships we'll see all sorts of different colors, predominantly because lots of ice, not to be stereotypical or anything. If we go down to Scharnhorst, Scharnhorst has a very similar camouflage pattern, but you can see it is changed a little bit. Again, with the white at the bow and stern of the ship to present the false bow and false stern of the ship. In fact, you can see here this is vertical, kind of like the original bow that the ships had, as opposed to the Atlantic bow or clipper bow that they have now. The profile of it did include a little bit of a false bow wave, but for the most part, the ship just stuck to the standard, trying to obscure the actual lines of the ship to hinder identification. Now, the Germans did also include a large number of ships that utilized actual modifications to the ships to obscure their identity. Obviously, the most famous of this is the Graf Spee, a Deutschland-class cruiser, who created a false second front turret to hide her identity, and in doing so, she actually employed that successfully while commerce raiding, and it hindered that identification long enough for them to take over some of the ships that they were trying to take over. Unfortunately, I don't have Graf Spee to show you, so when that comes out, I guess we'll have to have a video for its camouflage pattern. Let's dive on over to the Royal Navy. We're going to pull up the Warspite here. The Royal Navy did not have a dedicated camouflage pattern developed and painted on ships until 1940. Prior to 1940, they basically painted the ships as the captains saw fit. In 1940, they created the Admiralty Camouflage Scheme, which was the widespread used camouflage pattern by the Royal Navy. In fact, it stayed as the predominant camouflage until 1942 when it was modified. The Warspite here is wearing that camouflage pattern, and it is a series of large polygons, hard-edged objects, kind of digitized, if to compare it to modern camo, like the military's camouflages are all digitized. It has that same look, but they stuck to 2 to 4 colors, usually grays and dark blues and black. Sometimes you'll see dark grays. In the case of Warspite, we see a dark blue and a light gray, and then obviously the black lower hull. And this was designed almost entirely to hinder identification of the ship. The premise behind this wasn't to obscure the direction of travel or anything like that. They tried to make the ships look like something they weren't. In fact, probably one of the most famous, it wasn't necessarily the Royal Navy, it was the Royal Australian Navy's design, but if you look at the Perth in-game, she has the physical modifications to her smokestacks, and they are painted counter to each other to obscure the direction of travel. That was a little bit more elaborate, but in terms of most Royal Navy ships, we saw this blocky camouflage pattern known as the Admiralty Camouflage Pattern. In 1942, it was modified with larger polygons and more colors, still sticking primarily to the grays, blues, and then they added green, and again, it was to obscure the shape of the ship. They did add some other ones known as the Western Approaches Scheme, which consisted of a gray hull with a light painted green bottom hull that was designed to make the ship appear faster than it was actually going and confuse speed. Unfortunately, we don't have a very good example of that. Let's see if that's not Western Approaches. That's probably closer to the later Admiralty schemes that we see. And on to the last but not least, the Soviet Navy. The Soviet Navy, it's hard to find information about the Soviet Navy's camouflage patterns. The general consensus is that there was no consistency in it, and While they were painted in camouflage schemes, it's not known whether or not it had any real purpose, aside from to hide these ships while they were sitting in port from subs and other small attack craft like PT boats. For the most part, they stuck to the light blues, grays, whites. You'll see some reds, but the only thing that was ever consistent between all of the Russian camouflage patterns was the dark red decks, which is unique to their nation. I don't think any other nation painted their decks one consistent color, and certainly not red if they did. The coloration would change slightly depending on the area at which they were operating. So ships operating in the North Atlantic had more grays in them. Ships operating in the Pacific had some more greens in them. But generally there was no consistent patterns like we saw with like Measure 22 or Measure 32 or the Admiralty or Western Approach's camouflage patterns. Anyway, those are the 5 nations in the game's most common camouflage patterns. Let me know what you guys think. I know I had a lot of fun researching this topic, and I thank you guys for the question.